Canon of Kingsclere.
My lords, I declare my interest as a neighbour, and I flatter myself a friend of the minister. So I've observed him in his natural habitat, and I know him to be a countryman of deep passion and knowledge, whose excitement when he happens upon some rare beetle or some such is utterly infectious. Nonetheless, I listened in vain in his opening statement for any rationale. The first question we should ask of any legislation is, to what problem is this bill a solution? And when I say we, I particularly mean we in this House. I may be misunderstanding this. I've only been here for a short while. But anyone who's done A-level politics will tell you that this is a revising chamber. It's precisely here to ensure that legislation is proportionate. Proportionate to an identified problem, not proportionate to tabloid headlines or to an off-the-cuff pledge made at the dispatch box in another place to get a minister out of a temporary problem, or proportionate indeed to a social media campaign based on a misapprehension. To what problem is this bill a solution? My noble friend the Minister, in his opening remarks, listed the extensive animal welfare legislation that we have going back to mid-Victorian times. My noble friend Lord Herbert of South Downs trumped him and pushed it back to the Cruel Treatment of Cattle Act 200 years ago. Now, what all of that plethora of extensive and powerful animal welfare legislation has in common is that it is sensitive. It distinguishes between different situations and different categories. It distinguishes between wild fauna and pets. It distinguishes between livestock and vermin. It distinguishes between endangered species and pests. I think all of us agree. If any noble lords disagree, I've yet to hear from them on sentience being a reality. We don't need a bill to tell us something that is uncontentious. I was actually very struck by some experiments in 2019 on these tiny little darting blue fish called cleaner wrasse who exist in reefs, and they passed, it turned out, the most basic cognition test, which is recognizing themselves in a mirror. If you place a blob on the forehead of one of these little blue fish, Labroides dimidiatus they're called, they respond. Now, this is a level that human toddlers get to at around 18 months. They go, I experimented on my own on this one, they go from laughing at the baby in the glass with a dot to suddenly realizing that it's them. And that moment, at least as far as I can tell, goes hand in hand with lots of other developmental movement. They suddenly become self-aware. And they become, by the way, able to make moral choices. For the first time, you are conscious that they sometimes know that they're being naughty, something that up until that moment they've been unaware of. The Abrahamic religions make exactly that linkage. Our moment of the fall in the Judeo-Christian tradition comes from self-knowledge. It comes when Adam and Eve eat the fruit, and the eyes of them both were opened and they knew that they were naked. That's the moment when they become capable of making choices, moral choices. Now, I don't think any of us is going to argue that animals make moral choices, sentient, conscious, or not. When, to pluck a recent example, a good friend of mine in another place had a dog that chased some deer, it was not the dog that was put on trial. I think we would all agree it would be bizarre for the dog to be put on trial because a dog is not a reasoning creature. And when a dog is punished, it's not in the hope of contrition. It's not because we're hoping to persuade the dog that it has made wrong moral choices. What we mean by training when we train an animal is that we induce different desires, not that we inculcate an ethical sense. As the great philosopher and first economist Adam Smith put it, no one ever saw a dog make a fair exchange of one bone for another with another dog, right? So it is possible to acknowledge sentience, consciousness, without, of course, making an animal, if you like, a legal person with rights. And that's precisely why I do not want sensitive moral issues of this kind contracted out to a committee. We may have all sorts of criteria in our animal protection. It may be to do with how we grade the animal. it may be to do with the purposes to which it's being put. Lord Macaulay observed that the Puritan disliked bear baiting not because it gave pain to the bear, but because it gave pleasure to the spectator. Well, fair enough. We have banned bear baiting in this country on those grounds. I'd be surprised if any of your lordships wants to bring it back. But we make a different argument about, let's say, horse racing. It may well be that horse racing causes distress to the horse. I think it's probably a fair bet that a foal's idea of a good life, if it could express it, would not involve having a bit placed in its mouth and being ridden around by a whip-wielding ape. But we nonetheless are able to draw that distinction, and that is why we need to have these issues debated properly and sensitively, coming up from the people, not being handed down by organs of the administrative state. I suspect that, as the father of animal rights, the Australian philosopher Peter Singer puts it, that our circles of morality will continue to expand. And it may well be in our lifetime that all sorts of things that we now regard as quite normal are looked back on very differently. It may be that in future we'll ban horse racing, or zoos, or the treatment of pets, or indeed my noble friend Lord Forsyth of Drunleam's passion for fly fishing. It may be that we will wonder why it was ever acceptable to drag a fish, as it were, into a chamber of poisonous vapours with a hook lodged in its throat. I don't know, but I do know that those decisions should not be contracted out to a standing apparatus. If we are not prepared, here and in another place, to take responsibility for decisions of this kind, then what the blithering flip are we here for?
Lord Sarfraz.